jacket. We do have the AC on. So
Oh no, that's cool. I'd rather be cold.
okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Between You and Me and Jose, the Slims Presents podcast. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm your host, Chris. My special guest here tonight, it's just going to be me and this man, Ian Port, music editor for San Francisco Weekly. How long have you been writing for SF Weekly?
I've been writing for almost about 4.5 years. I've been on staff for nearly 4 years now. Yeah.
And you can follow him on Twitter at iPort, or also for the All Shook Down blog, which is at SF All Shook Down. So definitely go out there and follow Ian. Ian has been writing about the San Francisco music scene for SF Weekly in a way that a lot of music journalists, I think, haven't really been tackling as much in recent years with the changing landscape of print media specifically. I see a lot of parroting back of press releases and stuff like that. So it's refreshing to see someone that actually goes out and researches stories and, puts feet to the pavement and goes and talks to people and researches and develops a story and covers a side of the music industry that, is not really being addressed nearly as much as the days when, there was Rolling Stone was like the primary music cultural source, So I definitely recommend everybody check out Ian's content on SF Weekly. Every Wednesday there's a new issue. And do you have something in pretty much every week?
Yeah, usually there's at least one piece by me in the paper every week, and there's usually something by me every day on the All Shook Down blog as well. Yeah.
And you recently put out a cover story in the SF Weekly that got a fair amount of attention, and I think is an important issue for people to start talking about in the Bay Area, which the article is called Exit Music, and there's like two different subtitles, but basically is the San Francisco music scene doomed, or, with all the bands and musicians leaving for other places, is there a way that the scene can continue to thrive here? Which was the way the piece was framed, but I think what the piece was ultimately about was, let's all actually take a look at this industry in our city and how can it continue to sustain itself. The way things have changed in the last 10 or 20 years, a lot of the old avenues for artists don't exist anymore. We certainly have a changing landscape in terms of the demographics in San Francisco. It's always been a transient city. There's always been a lot of people that come and go, stay here for a few years, and then ultimately, move on to LA, New York, or, go back to their hometown or whatever they do. But with the new tech boom, separate from the .com boom, though its end may end up being somewhat similar, but we'll see, to be seen. But, the reality is there's a lot more money in the city than there once was. It's getting a lot more expensive. Mm-hmm. It's a lot harder for artists to be able to afford to live here. And on top of that, the demand for housing and places to put all these people with their money so that others can attain their money is sort of forcing out the established businesses that, created the mechanism through which art could thrive in San Francisco. And we're seeing that change a lot with, I always bring up the example of Slims specifically, where we had a neighbor who moved in, well, several neighbors, but we'll simplify the story, but that basically spent $1 million on their condo and didn't feel like they should have to hear people out drinking on the streets and having a good time. And have to hear music and whatnot. And so she called noise complaint after noise complaint, and eventually it resulted in us losing our alcohol permit for 10 days or something like that. And I know you actually covered this story in the weekly. And what ultimately we were able to survive that because we have other ways of making money. We run the music hall as well. We do all ages shows here, so we can have all ages shows and at least keep some money coming in. But a lot of businesses don't have that option. 10 days without being able to make any money, and they have to go out of business. So what was the first inkling that you noticed that this type of process was beginning? Had you seen it before this thing happened with Slims?
The Slims thing, I definitely kind of caught my attention, and that was actually pretty early on in my kind of tenure at the Weekly. I was coming back from South by Southwest for the first time, my first time at South by Southwest, and I was sitting in the airport in Austin, and I had seen someone reference something online that was like, "Slims is closed, what the heck?" And so I immediately got on the phone and I called Dawn, who sort of runs Slims in Great American Music Hall, and she told me what was going on. I couldn't believe it, and checked around, and sure, I mean, I believed Dawn, but it was a crazy story to me.
Right. That
there was a neighbor who sort of repeated noise complaints to the ABC, to the police department.
Often on nights that we weren't even open.
Yeah, well, and I think it all stemmed from a condition that's really common to a lot of the liquor licenses in the clubs in San Francisco, which is that technically speaking, no sound can escape the club at all.
Right. Yeah.
Even if the door, even when people are entering and exiting the club. So, like, in effect, you couldn't have your door. If any sound leaked out of the door when someone walked out or walked in, you'd be in violation of your terms. And I mean, I think there's a long history in San Francisco of the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control, and to some extent, I think the SFPD, really putting the screws to clubs based on these kind of incredible, strenuous conditions of their liquor licenses. And that's kind of a separate issue that I think was putting a lot of what was great about San Francisco in danger maybe more like 5 or 10 years ago, and then has since kind of subsided, and now we're facing a new set of issues, which is what I wrote this current story about. But I mean, I think as far as the first time I remember thinking that, like, man, this city is really changing, actually, was when Annie's Social Club closed.
Yeah.
I never went to Annie's that often, but it was always just one of those places, like, when I moved to San Francisco. I grew up in the Bay Area. I lived in San Diego for a while when I went to school, and a couple years after, and I moved back here. And Annie's was one of those places that I just loved right when I moved here, and it was cheap, and it was always lively, and, like, there were great bands, and there was a great karaoke room, as everyone remembers.
Yeah.
And it was cheap and fun, and you met weird people there, and it was exactly the sort of place that, you moved to San Francisco to go to.
Yeah.
And apparently not enough people moved here to go to places like that, because I think it's now, I drove by it the other day, it's called the Key Ultra Lounge.
Yeah, well, actually, that place is now defunct as well. So
it is, yeah.
It was Key Ultra Lounge for a while. Apparently, they didn't do too well with that business venture. Yeah. I only know this because our operations manager here, Dennis, he has a few ATMs around town.
Oh.
One at Hotel Utah, and the other one was at Annie's.
Annie's, yeah.
And, then it sort of fell over to Key Ultra Lounge, and then he recently had to go and pick up his ATM because they're out of business. So I never actually attended Key Ultra Lounge, for the record. Nothing against them. I'm sure they're fine, upstanding business people.
It was just, there were 354 Ultra Lounges in Soma, and the 355th, just, there was no room for it. Sorry. And then it was like, I remember watching, like, Chemo's closed.
Yeah.
And I mean, I remember talking to people at the time who were like, oh, did Chemo's really matter? But everyone was, Chemo's was always one of those places that, like, a local band could easily get a show, could play their first show at Chemo's. I saw some great bands from out of town play a show at Chemo's, like the night after they played a big sold-out show at, a big sold-out show like the Hemlock or maybe even Bottom of the Hill or something. They would play another night at Chemo's. And it was a useful spot in kind of, the ecosystem of clubs, and that went under, and I think now it's another $12 cocktail bar on Polk Street.
Yeah.
And so sort of like this momentum started to build. And then, of course, I mean, the major, I think, event that kind of catalyzed everyone's thinking about this was when Twitter moved into mid-market in 2012.
Yeah.
And that was really like, okay, the city is becoming a very different place now.
So let's explain this a little bit, because there might be people listening. There might be millions of people listening. Millions that don't live in San Francisco, and so they don't sort of understand the dynamic of what something like, Twitter moving in does to an area. Because the area that Twitter has moved into, it's an area that there wasn't a whole lot of stuff there. So it was an area where people could kind of afford to do things. And it was a place that hadn't quite been gentrified yet, hadn't been turned into $12 cocktail bars and whatnot.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of established businesses, long time, oftentimes immigrant businesses, where the business owners opened up their business in 1975 with some guy, who from the old country who happened to be here, and it was a handshake deal, and now the landlord hears that the person right next door just sold their space for however many $1 million. So I'm going to get this person out so I can make that money, and they don't have a lease, so I really have no obligation to do this legally. How does something like that begin the process of changing the face of the entire city?
Well, I think, Mid-Market is a part of the city that that mayoral administrations in San Francisco had been really wanting to change for a long time. I think it was a priority, going back to the days of Willie Brown, and even before then. Mid-Market was always seen as sort of a blight in the middle of this city. Like, you would walk down Market Street and you would get past Union Square, and then all of a sudden it kind of devolved, or so-called devolved, into, what I think actually was, it wasn't all great. There was a fair bit of crime, and there were, whatever, but there were like people playing chess on the street. There were liquor stores. There were people hanging out on the street. There were, kind of down market eateries like donut stores and pizza stores and like all night sandwich shops and Chinese eateries. And like, it was it was a lively, kind of sometimes rough place. And a lot of times there were just empty spaces. Like I remember at 10th and Market, which is right across from the building that Twitter occupies now, that was a hole in the ground for years. Yeah. And I think that a company had planned to build something there, and then right after the economy went down the toilet in 2008, I don't know what happened, if they backed out of that deal or if they, put it on hold for whatever, but that there was just a hole in the ground for many years. Yeah. So, Mayor Ed Lee in San Francisco got sort of heard that Twitter, which was then a fairly small company, wanted to leave San Francisco because it felt that the taxes were too high. And so he came up with a tax break, and I couldn't give you the exact details on it, but basically Twitter got a pretty hefty tax break to stay in the city, and Lee crafted a deal where they ended up moving into this old, I believe it was a furniture warehouse building on Market Street between 9th and 10th. Beautiful old kind of Art Deco building. Yeah. And shortly thereafter, by this point Twitter became a big thing. Shortly thereafter, they had their IPO. Right. And so suddenly there were all these like kind of millionaires on paper, and even non-millionaires on paper, who were making pretty good, like 6-figure or more salaries, who were working every day in this part of San Francisco that had been real blighted for a long time. Yeah. And it's not to say that the way it was before was like it should have stayed that way forever. Yeah. I think everybody can agree that the way Market was at that point in time was not necessarily desirable. You didn't really feel safe going to a show at the Warfield per se if you had to park a few blocks away. And I don't know that that's changed all that much, but it's not to say that things were perfect back then and they should have stayed that way. It's just that we really have to be conscious of the fact that these changes have more of an effect than just before there was crime and now there's not as much crime, and now there's storefronts opening and blah-de-blah. That's all great, but at the expense of who and what
what obligation do we have to have, a more inclusive economy that is sustainable and offers opportunities rather than coming in and exploiting the fact that these people didn't have much to begin with.
Yeah.
So they were easily taken advantage of.
Well, and I think landlords use the opportunity of Twitter moving in to definitely try to get more out of their tenants. And I mean, we're talking even like the existing kind of sandwich shops and donut shops or whatever that were all around there. Suddenly their landlords were jacking up the rent because they're like, oh, well, there are all these Twitter people around now. And well, like maybe those people didn't go to donut shops and didn't go to sandwich shops because they had their nice Twitter cafe in the office.
Yeah, because there were no Edison bulbs in the donut shop.
Right, yeah. But I think the other thing, too, is that, whether or not these places are necessarily good, I mean, it's hard to say whether these places are good or bad, but one thing that does happen when you have a space like mid-market that's sort of blighted or neglected in a city is that it tends to be a place that artists come in and remake it. Those empty storefronts and those empty warehouses and apartment buildings are spaces where artists can open, clubs or galleries or, whatever underground kind of spaces or live for cheap and do work that they wouldn't otherwise necessarily be able to do.
That's definitely true. And I think a lot of people, the irony is a lot of people move to San Francisco because of the culture that it's known for. And people have this idea of what San Francisco represents in their mind and all the history. And I'd say the vast majority of people, maybe pre-current tech boom, I would say the majority of people moved to San Francisco to find themselves. They didn't move here for a job or a career or anything like that. They moved here because they felt like they could experience something here that would resonate with them, a place that they could feel comfortable exploring themselves and finding out who they were. I think that was like the main drive for San Francisco, I would say at least after the 60s,
Yeah, I mean, I think you had a sense when you moved to San Francisco that the city could affect you or change you or open your mind to new things in a way that very, very few other places could. That sort of anything was possible in some sense here. And now, it's a very different place now. And it is there's that irony that a lot of people moving in here, I think, want the culture. They move here because of the culture. And certainly a lot of the employees of the major tech firms that are located down on the peninsula in Silicon Valley, they want to live in San Francisco and be bussed down there because they see San Francisco as being a more vibrant, lively place than those suburbs. And the irony is that I feel like San Francisco is becoming more and more like downtown Palo Alto every day.
Yeah. I mean, it's a cycle. So, I mean, it's hard in this discussion, like, to come across in a way that doesn't seem like you're necessarily attacking any one category of person or placing blame on this kind of person, because I don't necessarily lay this on individual people. I think this is a cycle. This is a system that is triggered and grows and has a pretty set in stone outcome. Once the process starts of you have an area that's been blighted, the process begins, well, I guess you could say it begins with the blighting of the neighborhood, and then the artists that take advantage of the fact that it's cheap to live there and not a lot of people are going to really mess with what they're doing there. And then the interest and hype that comes from an area where there are a lot of artists doing great art and then people wanting to be involved in that. And then comes the economic exploitation of this scene, which then, eventually prices out the people that created the scene in the first place and snowballs into this suburb, essentially.
Yeah, it becomes something else. And you see that happen all over. And I think one of the kind of the backstories of what's happening in San Francisco right now is that San Francisco is kind of coming into its own economically in a way that it didn't before. I think San Francisco, at least until the mid-90s, was always kind of a little bit of a backwater. Like, it was a an important place, and it was a lovely place, and people lived here, and there were some corporate headquarters here, but San Francisco never was an industry town in the way that Los Angeles was a media and entertainment town, and New York was a finance, media, fashion, many industry town.
Right.
And now San Francisco is kind of becoming the tech industry town.
Yeah.
And so there's just so much more money to go around, and the money all that wants to go somewhere cool. And the place that's cool is where the artists are or were.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these great transformations in this neighborhood, in these various neighborhoods. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, the unfortunate reality is that you can either spend, $3,000 a month on a house in Palo Alto, or you can spend $3,000 a month on, a studio apartment in San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
And, so it's not like it's, you can say, oh, well, they should live where they work. But at the same time, it's like, it's not exactly a great situation there either in terms of price.
Totally.
Because people down there know that they can get money out of these people.
Right. And that was what happened in the last tech boom too, is all the prices and the real estate prices on the peninsula went crazy. And I don't blame anyone for wanting to live in San Francisco. I think it's the most rational thing a person could possibly want to do. This is a great place. And I think the demand to live here in an economic sense is basically limitless. But I wanted to just bring up that I agree with you. I don't think it's like anyone's fault. It's not any individual or even necessarily any company's fault. This is a sort of byproduct of the way that our, national and global economic system works.
Yeah.
And of the fact that, one thing that troubles me about this is that there are so few good urban places in this country. Like there are so few dense, transit-driven, walkable cities actually in this country, if you really think about it. And there are especially few on the West Coast. And so naturally, people, I think, are gravitating to want to live in those places because they've come to realize the advantage of them. And San Francisco is is easily the best one on the West Coast and maybe even one of the best in the world. So, of course, people want to live here, and that's a completely reasonable thing. The sad part is that there isn't more of it for people to live in.
That's true. But at the same time, I as much as it isn't any one person's fault or any one group of people's fault, it's not to say that there is no fault. I think it's important that we actually look and address these issues and think about them as a culture and say, well, all right, we are seeing this happen very plainly in front of us, and it's not something that's necessarily desirable. Nobody wants the culture of a city to die, I would think, but it is, I think one of the things that your articles, and I'm not just referring to the Exit Music article, because I think there's a narrative that sort of goes through a lot of the pieces that you've done over the years, addressing the fact that that we are becoming aware of the patterns that are happening around us, and we're seeing the effect of our actions, and the byproduct of bringing in industry which is great for the city, a higher tax base, stuff like that, is the fact that you price out certain people that were actually of a benefit to the city and helped bring those people in the first place. And even though it's not one specific group's fault per se, it is everybody's problem. And it's something that we should deal with, and we should talk about and confront and try to use some of the technology that we have to figure out how to be able to create a landscape that nurtures creativity, nurtures entrepreneurship, nurtures people that don't have as much economic privilege as the next person. It's important that we think about and identify and talk about these things and take the opportunity that we have to figure out how we can restructure the way we're doing things to make sure that those values are reflected. And being that it's such a changing time I'd say for the whole world. I mean, as much as San Francisco is changing, the whole world is changing. The way our parents lived is almost so alien to the way we live today. It's crazy. And when you stop to think about how, even in our lifetimes, how many things that were institutions for previous generations are just not even a memory in someone's head at this point.
Yeah.
So, but, that is also an opportunity. Print media, which was one of the dominant forms of media throughout the 20th century, is dying. You've seen this firsthand at SF Weekly. You guys were recently purchased, is that right?
Yeah, it was about a year ago. We were purchased. We were sold from our one parent company to a new company.
And the new parent company also owns the Bay Guardian, and what is it? Is it the Chronicle, or is it the Examiner?
Yeah.
Okay. And so everything is really being consolidated, and in a lot of ways, the system, the way it was before, has sort of turned into this cycle of, it's a business. The point is to sell advertisement. The point is not to necessarily focus as much on culture and cultivating culture and investigative reporting and things like these. It's basically a mechanism,
Yeah, well, I think the thing with print media is that, until the internet was invented and became dominant, print media basically, had a monopoly on the distribution of written words in a given market, and the kind of benefits that we all took, the things that we all enjoyed about that, when I was in college, even like 10 years ago, the SF Weekly and the Bay Guardian both were like 120 pages a week.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at an edition now that's like, this is 60 pages a week, and this is pretty good. A year or so ago, before we were sold to the new company, we had been down to the low 40s sometimes even 40, and the Bay Guardian had been down into the mid 30s even before they were bought.
And are we talking just content? Or are we including
No,
ads?
that's a total page count.
Okay.
But the amount of content in any newspaper is proportional to the amount of ads sold. So the number of ads pages sold depends on how much space you get. So, I think, in the old days, media had basically a monopoly, and so it could afford to do all these things. It could afford to run, 120-page issues and run like 6 or 7 music stories a week in an alt weekly, and then 4 album reviews, and then 4 more local album reviews, and then a list of show recommendations. Because, there was no place else to go, and there was all this money coming in, and it was a very good way to make money. If you owned a printing press, if you owned the means of production back in the day as a daily newspaper or a weekly newspaper, you were basically printing money. It was a great business to be in. It was a fantastic business. And no one even really realized how fantastic it was until the internet came along. And suddenly, what had been a solid like 20% profit margin business went down to 10%, and these publicly owned newspaper companies, the owners of them balked and said, "You're only making a 10% profit. You were making a 20% profit. This is crazy. We have to cut staff and, stop doing all these things that we were doing." Yeah, exactly. And I can tell you right now that since SF Weekly was purchased by a new locally owned company, and yes, was consolidated at least financially with these other papers, although we remain editorially independent.
Yeah.
Since then, we've been doing much better financially. Since I was hired at the Weekly until we were sold, we were constantly worried about the future of the paper.
Right.
We were constantly coming into the office wondering, are we going to have a paper today? What's going to happen? And now we don't worry about it because we're doing okay now. We're on solid financial footing. We're not making reams and reams of cash, but we are doing totally fine. We're sustainable. So is print media dying? I think print media has found that it is no longer the dominant form of media in the world, as almost every other form of media has found in the wake of the rise of the internet. But I don't think print media is ever going to go away. And I think there's always going to be an attraction and a financial base to print media that the internet that will be different from the internet or television or radio. And so, yeah, it's been a weird, it's been a strange ride. I started working in newspapers right at the very, very darkest point, like around 2005, 2006, when everyone was saying that the industry was totally going to go away altogether. And, you know, a lot of the papers did go away in Seattle and Philadelphia and Colorado. And, you know, for a long time, we were sort of having a Chronicle death watch where we were waiting to see if the Chronicle was going to make it.
Yeah.
But, you know, they've survived. They continue to survive. So hopefully they continue to survive.
Yeah, I mean, you guys also are on the internet. So is the primary revenue source still the print media, or is the digital side actually making up a fair percentage of that?
I mean, I think the digital side, at least for SF Weekly, I can't speak for all the papers, but for SF Weekly, I think it makes up a pretty reasonable side. I do think that print maybe still pays most of the bills. But certainly you've seen, you know, nationally at least, newspapers that have done very well building a digital side have actually come to make enough money to support that and to replace a lot of the print revenue that's gone away.
So we can kind of think of this as like an analog to your article on the music scene.
Yeah, I think about the similarities a lot.
Yeah, definitely it's true. A lot of businesses are closing. Cafe du Nord, a great music venue, just recently closed down. Several years ago, the Pound, a great place for metal. You know, even on this street here, 11th Street, where Slim's is located, at one point in time, there was, you know, a club on every corner, very lively neighborhood. And for a while that declined. Caliente closed down, Paradise Lounge closed and then never reopened.
Yeah.
You know, and there was a lot of empty spaces and people did suffer. And now we're kind of seeing that the neighborhood is starting to come back. A lot of businesses are now opening. We have Beatbox that opened across the street, Bergerac and Audio Discotheque.
Yeah.
DNA Lounge has kind of, you know, restructured things a little bit and they're branching out a little bit more. Butter is still doing great. We have a classy joint next door, Bar Agricole.
Oh, yeah.
So, and we have the street food parks just a block away. So the neighborhood is kind of coming back to life. So the fear, the doom and gloom of thinking that, holy shit, like, it's all just going to go away and, you know, there's going to be a void. It's not necessarily true. That's not to say that what ends up coming in and taking the place and being the phoenix that rises from those ashes is going to live up to what was there before. But I don't think you can really, like, there's nothing you can do about that, really, unless you're going out there and being the entrepreneur yourself and creating what you want in that space. But I guess what is interesting is that everything sort of comes to an end and, well, not a full end, not a full stop, but everything flounders and some things die off, the stronger things survive, and a rebirth process happens. And do you see that is what is happening in the San Francisco music scene, even though we do have a lot of musicians, notable musicians, let's say, are fleeing for LA or Portland or Seattle or places like this? Do you see that the music scene is going through a rebirth rather than a death?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, at least in terms of the clubs, especially in terms of the clubs, you know, the clubs are not, I think, are maybe less in danger than the situation has been painted at. Like, you know, some clubs, I think, are going to do worse in the economy of San Francisco. Right. And those may happen to be some clubs that are sort of near and dear to my heart. But places like Chemo's and, Annie Social Club
Yeah.
and those kinds of places, sort of like lower rent, grimier, dirtier places that don't probably make a lot of money and, that maybe focus on kind of more fringe sorts of bands or artists or entertainment, those are going to have a harder time. Are clubs that, have Function One sound systems and have big name DJs, or are those going to do well? Yeah, those are doing great. Those are doing absolute gangbusters. And because obviously there's a lot of young people in the city with money and they want to go spend it and they want to go to clubs. Are those audiences different from what they used to be, even in those same clubs? I mean, I've heard from a number of people that they are, that the kind of, that people aren't as necessarily about the music as much as going out or whatever, or just being in a spot. But, who's to say whether that's really the case?
Yeah.
But so I think the clubs are going to do fine. The thing that concerns me is, what happens when San Francisco isn't a place that musicians want to come to anymore? That when this isn't a place where you can actually make art and do stuff.
Right.
There will always be clubs in San Francisco, and artists will always want to play here because there's history and there's great venues, and I don't think that's going to change. What I'm worried about is whether San Francisco can continue to kind of create, to spawn this stuff on its own, or whether it'll just be a host for it.
That's definitely true. I mean, I think the elephant in the room that sets San Francisco apart from a lot of other cities is that, yeah, San Francisco is very small, but Oakland is right there.
Yeah.
So if you can't afford to live in San Francisco, you can possibly, at least up until maybe a year or two ago, you could probably afford to live in Oakland and still not change up your life too much, and it would still be contributing to San Francisco culture and Bay Area culture as a whole. But a lot of places don't have an Oakland right next door where people can move to and continue to thrive. And we are seeing, one of the things that I took away from your Exit Music article, in which you went and talked to a lot of club owners, a lot of promoters, a lot of artists, and got their take on things, I'd say 90% of the people talked about Oakland. More than talking about San Francisco, they talked about Oakland.
Yeah.
And as someone who lives in Oakland, I found that very interesting, because while Oakland is a very culturally diverse and thriving community, there aren't a whole lot of opportunities for artists to sustain themselves in Oakland yet. Maybe that's to come. Maybe that's what's going to jumpstart the process all over again in the East Bay. But for the most part, the bands that we talk to, that we have here on the podcast, even if they live in Oakland, even if they love Oakland and prefer Oakland, they got to come to San Francisco to make money. So it's, I wonder what it would be like if there was no Oakland for artists to fall back on, and if they just had to leave for, LA, Portland, Seattle, somewhere in the Midwest. I think we'd probably be in a lot worse place than we are right now.
Yeah, we would. And I mean, I think as expensive as Oakland is getting, Oakland is so much bigger, so much more spread out. There's a lot of room to grow in Oakland. Whether that growth means that a lot of the, people who've lived in Oakland for a very long time and have roots there are going to no longer be able to afford to live there, just as those people have come to no longer live in San Francisco. That may be the case, and that, I think, is a very sad reality. I remember interviewing Boots Riley from The Coup, and he told me that, he said something like, in 20 years, there are going to be no black people in Oakland, and there'll be a Tupac museum.
That's a deep guy, Boots Riley.
Yeah.
He's awesome as well.
He may be right, but I think, I heard this from many people in my, reporting that, if Oakland wasn't there, it would be a sadder story, for sure. It would be a much sadder story.
So do you find yourself having to focus more on the East Bay as a journalist than previously?
Well, it's funny because, like you said, a lot of it seems like there are more and more bands that live in Oakland and that maybe even record or rehearse in Oakland, but they all seem to have to come here still to play shows. I do find that there are a lot more shows in Oakland that I want to go to.
Yeah,
and
for
that,
sure.
You know, there are like things like Burger Boogaloo, which is a 2-day festival in a park in Oakland that's like a bunch of kind of garage rock and like throwback retro rock.
Yeah.
Like Milk and Cookies and Ronnie Spector are playing this year. And like that's something that, you know, I would definitely go to Oakland to see that. And then there are lots of shows at places like Eli's or the Uptown or those venues that seem, you know, pretty cool and worth going to. But you know, we're sort of trying to figure out at the weekly, like, how much Oakland we should cover being San Francisco Weekly.
Yeah, I mean, the name is San Francisco. So.
Yeah.
But
and
at the same time, I don't think you can really talk about, if you live here, you can't talk about San Francisco without talking about Oakland at the very least.
Yeah.
And, you know, so if you're talking about someplace like LA, that is a massive, massive, massive place with, you know, you can talk about LA as a whole and not have to break it down into the different little neighborhoods. But essentially the fate of San Francisco is so intertwined with the fate of Oakland at this point that it's hard to stay relevant with the culture of San Francisco without talking about Oakland.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, do you find that, how do you feel about it? Like, are you optimistic about the future of Oakland and people moving over there and a kind of more vibrant scene coming up there?
I definitely have mixed feelings about it because I'll go back a little bit. I'm from LA originally. I moved up to the Bay Area in 1999 and I lived in Oakland. I went to college in Oakland. I spent about 6 years living in Oakland, and eventually my last 2 years in college, our classes were more focused on San Francisco, so I ended up moving over to San Francisco to finish up college, and I met the woman that would ultimately become my wife, who was a lifelong San Franciscan. So I spent some time in San Francisco and ultimately felt drawn back to the East Bay. I felt like it was more authentic, more what I was accustomed to having grown up in LA. A lot more real people that had been born and raised there and cared about their community and actually talked to their neighbors and got involved in things. And one of the weirdest things when I had moved back to Oakland from San Francisco, I had spent about, maybe 4 or 5 years in San Francisco. And the craziest thing was everyone was talking to me. Like, all the neighbors were like waving to me and striking up conversations, and people on the street would just say stuff to me and, ask me about my dog and just all kind of random stuff that at first, once you spent so much time in San Francisco, it catches you off guard because you're you're used to just like walking with your head down. You don't even know the person that's lived next to you for 10 years. But that's very different in Oakland. So, and that's one of the things that's appealing about it. And one of the unfortunate things that I've been seeing with Oakland sort of experiencing or sort of mopping up the spills from San Francisco, the people that can't sustain themselves in the city and move to Oakland because it's the only way that they can have a decent life. Again, I don't blame these people. It's just the way it is. It's just the cycle, They got to live somewhere, But I see more and more the culture or lack of culture spilling over from what has happened in San Francisco into Oakland and starting to change the fabric of what was actually felt right about Oakland, because it's people that aren't investing in the community there, and they aren't talking to their neighbors and thinking of themselves as part of this greater thing. They're coming in and doing what you would do in San Francisco, which is, I want a coffee shop on the corner of my neighborhood so I can walk to it and get coffee in the morning. I want to have a convenient life. Again, I don't blame people for wanting this, but you're coming in and imposing yourself on some place that existed long before you were there, with people that existed long before you were there, and taking actions that might end up having serious impacts on their lives and their livelihood and their ability to continue staying there. So I see pros and cons to it. I mean, the reason that I moved to Oakland is because it was what I could afford. You know, I could get a good apartment and not have to live in a box like I was living in San Francisco, and not have to live all the way out by Lake Merced where my friends would never come and visit me. And every morning I walk out and there's just a wall of fog and I would have to have two outfits, the one for leaving my house and then the one ultimately for wherever I ended up in San Francisco that had a completely different climate. But, you know, I see these things trickling over into Oakland from San Francisco. And there's a lot of positive aspects to it, a lot of great businesses that have opened up because of this. There's a lot of great restaurants in Oakland now. Neighborhoods that I just 10 years ago walking through would have been terrifying, are actually nice neighborhoods now. You know, it's such a complex issue that it's hard to really talk about without looking at the whole macro picture and understanding the subtle back and forth and how all these things are interrelated and connected and how certain actions affect other people and other communities. And it's great that there are places for artists in Oakland. A lot of, and to be honest, a lot of the places, there wasn't anything happening there before, you know. There are always cases where, you know, people are being pushed out because landlords want to make more money and be able to rent to different tenants. But at the same time, there was a lot of empty space, a lot of storefronts that hadn't had anything in them for years, like we were talking about before in the mid-market area.
Yeah.
A lot of Oakland was blighted. Downtown Oakland, you know, when I moved here, there was no reason to be in downtown Oakland. There was very little there. Most of it was shuttered. There were a few businesses here and there, but nothing that really made people want to go there and stay there. So I see both sides of it, you know. On the one hand, it's positive for the overall culture, and on the other hand, it's starting a cycle that's ultimately going to lead to the death of that culture. And being so close to San Francisco and seeing it up close, I think there's a benefit there that Oakland can learn from those mistakes. And I think Oakland is a place that people do feel more of a connection to living in Oakland than people feel in San Francisco, because it's their city. They were born there, they were raised there, or it's the place that provided them their lives, their livelihoods. And they want to protect that. They don't want to see that go the way of San Francisco. So there's active involvement with people trying to steer it in a direction that is more in line with the values of Oakland. And that I really appreciate. That I think is what needs to happen in San Francisco. And that's why I'm very appreciative of articles like the one that you wrote that really force people to take a look at their actions and how they support the thing that they love. You know, how can they ensure that they are contributing to the ability to keep this culture going? So definitely thank you for writing that article.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know, and I apologize. I talk a lot, so that's just the way I am.
That's all
but
good.
I ramble. That's why I have a podcast. But I think it's an important issue, and there are, you know, we've had a lot of bands on this podcast that are primarily in Oakland, and they are some of these people that are the scouts of gentrification, as it's been put. And again, they don't see it as that. They don't see that they're doing something wrong. And I don't necessarily see that they're doing something wrong, but obviously the chain effect is a negative in the long run. So something's got to change.
Well, unless that we can figure out a way to have it not have the same outcome as it's having in San Francisco and
Right.
it's had in other places. Yeah.
So you've had, after the article was published, you had a panel discussion at the chapel
Yeah.
about this issue, hoping, I imagine, to come up with some kind of dialogue and perhaps have some solutions come out of it. Was there anything that you took away from that as things we can do to start steering this in the right direction?
Yeah. I mean, I think the larger... I think that the big issue in the background of all of this that leads to the kind of changes that we're talking about is really housing and economics in California, in San Francisco, and in this country in general. And those are big issues that have to do with tax policy, property tax policy, economic inequality, education policy, and, the kind of state support for corporations. But, short of getting into all that, which I don't think we necessarily want to, which I think was ultimately where a lot of the most important changes could lie. I think any effort San Francisco can make to help artists live here or help artists work here or help, in any way support artists doing stuff here, to encourage them for that is a good thing. And there are a lot of efforts underway and there are a lot of things that could be done. One of the things is the city is trying to encourage more local businesses to hire musicians to play. And we're not talking like clubs necessarily, but cafes, restaurants, bars, smaller venues, places that don't necessarily have a stage, but could say have like a jazz combo come in or a pianist or like, someone come in and play an acoustic guitar and sing some songs on a Saturday night. They would bring people in and they would give a musician or musicians money. So the city has a new permit that's supposed to allow that and make that easier. And they've been pretty slow getting it off the ground because a lot of people didn't know about it or didn't understand why they should get it. And there's a pretty big effort underway right now, actually starting this week, to encourage businesses in places to encourage certain businesses to get those. Like there's a nonprofit here in the city called You Love that actually is sending out teams of people to restaurants and cafes along Valencia Street this week, telling them, hey, this performance permit exists, you could hire musicians, and, ULove is offering things like they can even just contract with ULove, and ULove will book the musician, bring in a sound system, decide what to pay the musician, and all the business has to do is basically say when they want music and provide the money. So I think that, that's a small step. Obviously, that's not going to solve the whole issue that we're talking about here, but it's a good one. I think that would be really helpful. And, the contrasts, I think, with other cities, like, say, with Austin or, like, New Orleans. If you go to New Orleans, there really is live music everywhere downtown. I was shocked when I went to New Orleans, and I've only been there once, and it was a while ago before Katrina, so I can't speak to what it's like now, but, there were musicians on every corner. Every restaurant had a musician, like, not just for dinner, but for brunch, cafes and stuff. And that really kind of gave you a sense that the city cared about that stuff. And you don't get that sense here in San Francisco, even though we do have a ton of live music. And I think that would be helpful. There are other groups working on like a community center and combination kind of residence for musicians that would provide subsidized housing so that some musicians could live there and stay in the city, and there would be a place for musicians to gather and rehearse and trade ideas and do things like that, which I think is a promising development. What I would really like to see, though, is more support from the companies that are paying workers so much money to live in San Francisco
Right.
for the music that they're, inadvertently or not helping to displace. And I think there are some companies that are doing that. There's one called GitHub in Soma that actually built like kind of a performance space in its first floor. It's like entry level. And they're hosting performances there. And right now they're not open to the public. I think they've only done one. But they're paying musicians pretty good rates to, go put on a show there. And it's invite only, and it's for the company and for other people so far in the community. But something like that I think is really cool. And not only does it give musicians like money to perform in San Francisco, but it gets those employees who watch the show interested in local music. And maybe they'll go out and go to other shows and, find out about other bands. The other thing I really don't understand that why we have so few of is basically like corporate residencies. I mean, I feel like these companies, so many tech companies in this city could afford, say, like, to spend $10,000 every 6 months and give like $2,500 or $5,000 or whatever to like an artist, have them play a couple shows for a company, like a company party or like a company happy hour, put them on the website, like have them, do something for the company, its employees, and then also the company could give that artist some kind of publicity and support, and that amount of money would be insignificant for so many of these companies, and it would be huge for the artists that are trying to live and work here.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of stuff that could be done. And, I have more and more ideas than that even.
Well, do you see, riffing off what you just described about companies providing opportunities for artists, booking them for in-office shows and using native advertisements to sort of prop up and support art. What do you see as the, do you think that is a slippery slope in terms of like creating a system where it's the corporations essentially that are, deciding who gets exposure, who gets to live as an artist, et cetera, and artists having to like, go after this as their primary means of supporting themselves. You recently did a post about a Lyft video with some local rappers, A1, who is a great San Francisco-based rapper. We've had him here at Slim's, and Say Knowledge, and I can't remember who else. But they are freestyling in a Lyft car, and it's being videotaped, and probably is a promotional tool for Lyft.
Sure, absolutely.
As well as for the artists. But, number one, who gets the primary benefit out of something like that? Is it necessarily a fair trade for the artists? And what are the possible outcomes for creating an economy that is, based off of this sort of paradigm?
Well, I think there's a big difference between, having these kinds of small quarterly or biannual residencies. And there's a big difference, or a long way from that to kind of creating an economy that's based on that. I think it would have to be a lot of companies and a lot of money and a lot of bands doing that before we saw like people kind of trying to make themselves appeal to Google or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. But that said, we already do exist in a music economy where bands sort of make themselves available and make themselves desirable to corporations to do various things, like whether it's, Converse or Mountain Dew or Lady Gaga and Doritos.
Yeah.
And that's part of the game now. And I don't like that at all, personally. I really dislike that. I, grew up kind of idealizing things in the early 90s and like, don't sell out. And I still kind of question the decision that artists make sometimes to make a living or barely make a living as a musician if it means basically shilling for a corporation versus not doing that and making whatever they actually want to make. But that's for them to decide, not me. So I think it is a slippery slope. But at the same time, it seems like the most direct way of kind of rectifying the situation where like you have companies drawing people that are displacing artists and then, to kind of create some sort of support. I mean, maybe the companies could have a layer of, independent, I'm not necessarily suggesting that companies would just give their money over to an independent panel that would then hire the musicians for them or something. But
Right.
there may be ways to get around that. As for the Lyft video, I think that there are ways that artists can partner with corporations and brands to do things that are very beneficial to both the artist and the brand. And then I think that there are ways that are very hypocritical and, negative for everyone involved. I recently wrote too about this Nick Waterhouse ad.
Oh yeah, Lexus.
It was a Lexus ad for Nick Waterhouse. Yeah. And at first when I saw this ad, it was like, I thought it was really weird. Well, actually, no, the first time I saw the ad, I thought like, who are all these people in this Lexus kind of like getting down to this cool music?
Yeah.
And then like a few seconds into the ad, they showed Nick Waterhouse's name a couple times, and then they showed the car driving past like a wall of Nick Waterhouse posters, and then everyone in the car ends up like partying at a Nick Waterhouse concert, and it says Nick Waterhouse and like gives his new album and stuff.
It's basically a commercial for Nick Waterhouse.
It's totally
more
a commercial
than it
for
is
Nick
for
Waterhouse.
Lexus.
Yeah, and I thought Nick Waterhouse really came out on top of that one, and I'm sure like. Lexus probably felt that Lexus came out on top of that one. But it was an example, I thought, of a way that a band and a corporation could work together in a way that was, like, okay for both of them. And where, like, Nick wasn't really being too exploited.
Right.
And he was basically getting ads on primetime TV. I mean, this ad aired during the Super Bowl. So
yeah,
he must have gotten a lot of attention out of that. At least I hope so. So I think there are ways to get around it, even though, like, I'm not a huge fan of the system, although it is sort of the way that artists have to make money now.
What do you think about things like the Red Bull Music Academy, where if people don't know what that is, Red Bull sponsors lecture series by established artists. It tends to be more in the electronic realm, but and they have classes for artists, upcoming aspiring artists, to come and learn from established artists and learn types of gear and stuff like that and hear these people speak. But ultimately it's, one might say it's an ad for Red Bull, more so than, and a lot of people think that they're exploiting this scene for their own gain. I mean, do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, they're definitely getting something out of it, but I feel like, especially with Red Bull Music Academy, they're really putting a lot. It seems like they're putting a lot into it. It seems like these artists are getting a chance to do something that they would otherwise not get a chance to do. Meeting people, learning things, getting to work on equipment that's, new to them. It's an opportunity for them. So I think it sort of has to be up to the artist to decide whether that's something that they're comfortable with. And I can respect people going either way, really. I haven't seen, Red Bull is another one, like, they really seem to do a lot. And then, another example would be Converse, who's been here in this city, who did a bunch of shows at Slim's, who paid for a bunch of bands to record at a local studio, and gave them a lot of publicity, like put a local band called the She's on, like, billboards around the city. Yeah. Got them a lot of attention. I think it's hard to argue that the artists aren't getting a lot out of that. Yeah.
And I mean, I definitely, I'm in the same boat as you. Like I came of age in the 90s, and there was this very idealistic mindset, and in a lot of ways a very, the progression of the punk rock mindset.
Yeah.
Where it was very much about authenticity and staying true to yourself and not selling out and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that, that was propped up by the recording industry, which doesn't have the power that it had at that point.
Yep.
And those people were coming out much better than even the artists were. You hear on the recent documentary, The Tanning of America, I don't know if you saw that on VH1.
No.
Interesting. I definitely recommend it, about how hip hop culture has been integrated into American culture.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the examples was well, there are several apt examples here. One of which is the hip hop artists realizing that the power that they had in being able to sell things, mentioning gin and juice in a song, and then all of a sudden, the sales of Seagram's gin skyrocket, So it starts this process where people start to realize that, they actually have power. They're reaching a whole lot of people, and they can leverage that power and, get some money out of these companies and, still be, I guess, somewhat staying true to themselves. I think Snoop Dogg's Gin and Juice song was not done as a ploy to promote Seagram's gin. But, I think later, once people started realizing this, stuff like Past the Cavassier and P. Diddy coming out with his own brand of vodka and things like this, started really, really taking it down a road where, it became, shilling for corporations, basically. And I'm not even quite sure where I was originally going with this, but it's an interesting concept that, and if you look at hip hop today and the state of where hip hop music is, it's completely lost that authenticity that I think drew people to it in the first place. And a lot of what you're hearing on the radio and what is being signed by the few labels that are still actually, doing business, major labels, that is, it's pop music, basically. And it becomes, through this process of realizing the economic power that you have and then asserting that economic power, you're essentially, diluting what it was. So, I don't know. I mean, coming out of this mindset where it's important for artists and art to stay authentic and not be sold out to corporate interests. But the truth is we're living in a time where people don't want to contribute themselves to art. We all still have the option of paying for music, and a lot of people don't. Simply because it's available for free, why should I have to pay for it? And that's a discussion that I think we as a culture at this point have to have. If information is freely available, where is the value? Is it in the song file? Is the song the value, or is, where at what point are you obligated to,
to kick in something,
support the person?
Yeah, there was something I read last week where they were talking, like a financial industry expert was talking about how streaming services like RDO and Spotify are eventually no longer going to be things that people pay for directly. They're going to be like kind of perks thrown in with the purchase of, like, say, a new set of headphones or like a car or, a magazine subscription or something. You're just going to, we'll throw in, 6 months of RDO or 2 years of Spotify or something like that, which is just, I mean, already you're getting such a ridiculous bargain paying $10 a month for something like Spotify.
Right.
And then to just not even have to pay for it, for music to just be completely, all access to it or access to almost all of it. Don't pay anything. It's that is terrifying to me.
Yeah.
I don't agree, though, necessarily that by embracing its sort of power to shell things that hip hop has kind of lost its authenticity. I think authenticity in hip hop is a much more fluid and elusive concept than it was in like independent music or independent rock, in like the 80s and 90s. And it means a whole different thing. I think Jay-Z is being Jay-Z when he's shilling Hublots and Maybachs. I personally don't like that.
Right.
It's not interesting subject matter for me. I don't think it necessarily makes for the greatest art.
Right.
But I think, authenticity is something that each kind of scene sets on its own or defines on its own. And it's a pretty shaky concept anyway, but I think that I guess I don't know that like corporate sponsorship or corporate ties totally spoil it for anyone, but they it's all in the mind of the artist and what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing.
I think the point that I that I was trying to illustrate with talking about the tanning of America, something that was mentioned in there that was a little bit astounding, but I guess not that surprising. Talking about the old record label structure and what that did to cultivate art in a way. There were a lot of positives that came out of that. A lot of bands were groomed, and I don't think there would have been a Beatles if there wasn't this machine to put it out there. But at the same time, one of the things that they addressed in this documentary was that Dr. Dre, Beats by Dre headphones, he's made more money selling those Beats by Dre headphones than he ever made throughout his entire recording history.
Yeah.
Going from, I guess, what was before NWA, something, Wrecking Crew, to NWA, to The Chronic, to Snoop Dogg, to Mary J. Blige, to Eminem, to like, this guy's made so many hits. You would expect that he would have made so much money from those hits. But he's made more money in just a few years of selling headphones than in his entire career as a recording artist. So what does that say, as to what value we put on the artists that are creating the product that, I'm sure that wouldn't be the same situation if we were talking about the CEO of Interscope Records. I would say that person probably made just about as much money as Dr. Dre is making off of headphones off of Dr. Dre. So,
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, that establishment was one of the reasons why we had such a thriving music scene in the 90s. I mean, I think the 90s was an amazing time for music. It was, to me, sort of the, I guess, beginning of the end of major label music, in the sense that it was still putting out great stuff. You had a lot of really classic albums that came out during that time. But it was when you started to see labels focusing more on what can I get now? Not what is this band going to be, in 5 years, when after I've, cultivated them and they put out a record or two on my label, and then we can really, knock out that masterpiece release. And it started focusing more on, okay, what's gonna be a big hit tomorrow, and what's gonna get me the most money, and where I don't have to invest that much up front.
Yeah. And how much can we possibly charge people for CDs?
Well, yeah.
But yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Like, one of the, with the death of record sales, when record sales were still a thing, when people would still pay money for records, that enabled a whole that gave independent music a whole power that it just doesn't have right now. I mean, I remember talking to, Fat Mike from NoFX. Yeah. And he'll tell you, you ask him, like, he likes to talk about, his partying and, like, doing drugs. And it's like, Fat Mike, what do you tell your daughter or your kids about, like, doing drugs? And he's like, well, I tell them after they're 30 and they've made their first $1 million, they can do whatever they want. And, like, this is a guy who started a record label, played on his punk band, put his friends' punk bands on it, and sold records. Yeah. I think eventually he got some sort of major distribution, but he certainly didn't start out with it. Right. And that kind of independent record sales enabled that. It enabled these empires. It enabled SST, Greg Ginn, Black Flag. It enabled Discord and Ian MacKaye and all of those bands, and gave them like a kind of economic power that bands just don't have anymore, because they only can make money really through touring or selling their image or music to corporations.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a product to sell anymore. Yeah. It's
exactly.
Before, you could go out and purchase a CD or a LP or even a cassette. And that was a tangible thing that you were paying for that you wouldn't be able to get if you hadn't gone and paid for it. I mean, yeah, you could walk into the store and put it in your jacket and hope to get out without
And then you have to
getting
figure out how to
caught.
crack the CD case
Right.
holder open, which is no easy feat.
I mean, what do you think about the way things stand right now? Should people pay for that intangible product now?
I think people should pay for something. If you like something, pay for it. I think
Right.
it's like inexcusable that you don't. If you find an album that you like, you should go see that band. You should go see them at a show if you can. And I feel like you should buy a t-shirt or a record or buy something buy something physical to support them. I mean, it's crazy to me how people complain about spending $10 for or $5 for a 7-inch, or $10 for a t-shirt, or $15 for a t-shirt. And I mean, granted, if bands are charging you $40 for a t-shirt at a concert, that's a different story. But like, how much do you spend on coffee every week?
Right.
Like, how much do you spend on beer every day? Like, spend
Yeah.
some money on things that you like. It's pretty easy. It's and I think that's just something people forget a lot and kind of overlook and realize, like, you're giving your money. Yes, you're trading your money for something, but you're giving it to something that's good. And so much of life in this capitalistic world is giving your money to things that you have to that aren't good.
Right. Well, how do we cultivate that? I mean, that saying that is definitely very true, but I think that's the hardest thing to possibly overcome, is you have to basically reprogram people's value systems and the way they live their lives. And you had mentioned earlier that, there's a few things that are going on right now with the city of San Francisco and nonprofits and all these people trying to find little Band-Aids to fix the problem. And, but ultimately those things are just Band-Aids. They're not addressing what the actual problem is, which is like an overarching cultural problem.
Right. And
so how do you begin to change that? Because I think what you said is true. The nonprofit organizations in San Francisco that are trying to create opportunities for artists, the city trying to create special permits for restaurants and whatnot, all that stuff is, it's good. Mm-hmm. It's, certainly not a step in the wrong direction, but just doing that is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Because ultimately we have a problem with our cultural value system.
Yeah.
And do you see a responsibility of the media to start to reprogram people and start to bring up these things so that they can start to think about it and think about their impact and where their money is going and how, the result of what happens when you decide to just download something for free and not go to a show, not buy any merch, not support this band at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think that there are a lot of efforts underway to kind of help remind people of that. I've heard like some criticisms of Record Store Day from various people, but I think that ultimately the idea of like making people go out or encouraging people to go out one day a year and spend a bunch of money in a record store is not a bad thing. There are certainly arguments against it that I think are valid, and there are criticisms of it that are valid, but I think that's been a positive force. It's encouraging to see that bookstores are now doing the same thing.
Bookstores?
California.
What are these bookstores you speak
Bookstores, yeah. They're these amazing places where you go and they have all these words printed on paper and bound together, and they're like on shelves, and you can stand there and read them. They even have SF Weekly in some of these bookstores. It's pretty cool. But I think it's easy to sit here and say, if you love something, support it. Yeah. And granted, like, that's basically what I'm saying. I think it would be easier for people to support things if, the sort of background economic circumstance of everything was not as difficult and as sort of painful and, rigged as it is now. And that's even something that people brought up in talking about when I was researching my article. People brought up to me things like Prop 13, the way that property taxes in California are fixed on at a certain rate and basically never increase, which means that there are a lot of people living in houses or businesses, working in offices that are paying tax rates based on the assessed value of like 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, which is far below what they're worth. And that means that the state doesn't have money to fund things like, say, public education and, science research, or like an arts program or music and arts programs in schools, or all these kinds of things that would ultimately lead to us having a more vibrant and better state. And would ultimately lead to more young people having fewer student loans and therefore more disposable income that they might feel more inclined to buy things like music and books and, concert tickets with. So I think that's part of it. I think that there's a lot to be said about housing policy in San Francisco, and the difficulties there are myriad, and I'm no expert on them. But, it seems incredible to me that we can't find a better way to force the companies and the developers who are coming here and building properties that are going to make very large amount of money to actually build affordable housing. I mean, I have a good friend of mine this week actually went through the process. This is like months and months and months. Finally actually did get a below market rate apartment in San Francisco.
Wow.
And it was like it's a huge deal, I think, because it is not easy to do.
No.
But there are so few of them being built, and so many of these developers are building buildings, and then instead of actually building the affordable housing, are just paying a fee into the city's coffers. But that doesn't actually build housing. That just puts money in a city account that then may or may not ever actually get used to build something. So I think stuff like that matters. And again, I think it's sort of a slow cultural awareness. And I do think that people will get the point eventually through the kind of cajoling of these efforts and through the witnessing things like the disappearance or the dwindling, shall we say, of musical culture in San Francisco, that they do need to support this and make a place for it, or it will go away.
Now, do you think that it's one of the things that you mentioned was Prop 13?
Yeah.
And property tax law, and the Ellis Act is another big one in the Bay Area right now. But ultimately, I feel like a lot of the solutions that are put forth to certain problems really are just attempts to like pass the buck on to somebody else, like so that somebody else can foot the bill rather than actually addressing the problem. And as someone who, owns a home and pays property tax to the city of Oakland, which I then don't see used in a particularly efficient or meaningful or positive way whatsoever. I don't even know where the money is going. Well, actually I do. It's probably going into the pockets of, who was it that the city made the deal with? Like one of the big Wall Street companies.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember which one right now. But anyway, the money is ultimately being pissed away. And we see this a lot in owning clubs, that a lot of times the city of San Francisco, their solution to a problem will be, okay, well, let's tax sugary beverages, like let's tax the sale of alcohol per pint, and just pass that cost on to small business, and cool, we're done. But in effect, that's putting more of a strain on the small business and ensuring that only the big Twitter corporations with tons and tons of capital behind them are actually the ones that come in and can afford to continue to be in business and pay these things. So I think what we're addressing here is that none of these things are separate. These things that we think of as political issues or economic issues, they have a direct effect on the things that matter to us. Even if you're not a homeowner, and you don't have to pay property tax, or even if you're not a small business owner and you don't have to pay these fees to the city and fines and get a permit for every little thing, the fact that is happening is affecting the ability for culture to thrive in that environment. And it is important for people to face the tough reality of looking at this incredibly broken system that is admittedly incredibly depressing to look at and think about and address in a realistic way. You can't help but want to like recoil from it because it's such a like, it's a paradigm shattering like thing to look into the way we do things in this country, the way our society is structured. But none of this is going to ever be better if we don't take a look at those hard things and we don't confront the ugly truth. I mean, I'm sure for every person that agreed with your overall sentiment in your articles about the San Francisco music scene and the influence of tech money on the entertainment industry in the city, there were, probably a fair amount of people that disagreed with you and probably had some not so friendly things to say about it.
Of course.
And there is an aversion for people wanting to actually acknowledge that this is real.
Yeah, definitely.
It's, I think that's the biggest hurdle in my mind, is getting people to look at these things and have the strength and courage to confront them in a way. And I think the conclusion that I arrive at is that you got to play the game like the people that are ruling the game now are playing the game. The powers that be got to where they are by using media to dictate to people the way they wanted them to behave in a way that was going to have a benefit to them. That's what advertising is. That's what commercials are. That's what television channels are, is people, corporations, companies paying money to exert influence over culture. I mean, when you boil it down, that's what marketing and advertising is. And it's not necessarily a pretty thing to look at, but we do have to look at the fact that this is how our system is working, and this is how it's been operating for a very long time. And for a long time, we haven't questioned it because it was working. And now that it's not working quite as well for quite as many people, I think it's time to really sit down and look at how can we use the same tools that were used to exploit people in the past to drive home the message that, people like you and I want to get across, which is that you have to place value on certain things. You have to contribute in order for things to survive. You can't just unplug and expect that everything is going to continue to operate.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I like to think of it in kind of terms of, the environmental movement. I mean, the environmental movement 50 years ago basically didn't exist. It was spawned by a few books that people wrote and a few kind of crazy things that some wild hippies came up with. And in the last, 50, 60 years, 70 years, we've spawned this massive awareness, and we've drastically changed the way that almost everything on this planet is done, because we've become aware of things like, greenhouse gases and polluted water and acid rain and clean air. And which isn't to say that we fixed them all, but I think that we've only maybe recently become aware of the importance of healthy urban environments in the same way that we become aware of the importance of healthy natural environments. And to me, a vibrant culture, artistic culture, music, arts, literature, those are part of a healthy urban environment, and we need to find a way to support them and make sure that they're sustainable in the same way that we have, clean air and clean water. That's just part of what it means to be a person living on Earth in the 21st century. And I think that maybe that awareness is going to take time to percolate, but I think that it can get there. And I'm hopeful at least that long term, maybe these changes will affects places like, I think it certainly has happened in New York. It's happening very seriously in San Francisco. It's happening slowly or not slowly, but it's starting to happen now in Oakland. Maybe down the road we'll get to the point where we can keep these from happening or even reverse them somehow, through, different means, whether it's political changes, economic changes, cultural changes. We certainly had all three in the environmental movement, and maybe we will in the kind of whatever urbanist movement, whatever you want to call it. That's how I like to think. I like to think of it that way anyway.
Well, I want to kind of, leave this on a more positive note. It isn't all doom and gloom. So what are some things that are really excite you about the Bay Area music scene right now? We're not just going to limit it to San Francisco, but what are some reasons to rejoice about the Bay Area music scene right now? What gets you excited?
I mean, there's just the same thing, despite all this talk that we've had about musicians leaving and whatever, there are just still so many cool shows to see every week. I mean, there's just like no lack of major touring artists who are coming through and local artists who are coming up, and just like fun stuff to go check out that you can kind of lose yourself in every night if you want to. I remember when I didn't go to South by Southwest this year, and everyone was like, "Oh, you're not going to South by Southwest, huh?" And I was like, "No, I'm going to go see what the shows are like in the city when South by Southwest isn't happening."
Right.
And everyone like, "Oh, there won't be anything. It'll just be dead." And you know what? It wasn't dead.
Yeah.
There was a lot of stuff, and I was like at a sold-out show on a Thursday night, at the chapel, going to something that I probably would never go to on a regular basis just for the hell of it, to see what was happening and see what... And, so I think when you're living in a place that's as big and as diverse as the Bay Area, you can kind of forget, especially when you get kind of deep into your own little scene, whatever it is that you like, you forget how many people there are and how many different little weird tribes and subcultures and, music scenes there are. And so I think I always just get excited about being able to go to, like, whatever, just crazy different stuff.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, there's still... for all the things that are happening that you could consider negative in the Bay Area music scene, there is no lack of stuff to do.
Yeah.
There's always something going on pretty much any night of the week. And for venues like Slim's and the Music Hall and a lot of the venues that, we really admire around the city, there's a conscious effort to prop up local artists. And every show, even if it's a national touring act, if at all possible, we want to put a local band in that support slot.
Yeah, and that's a great, huge thing for the local music economy. And I think people sometimes don't realize that. And, when people do realize that, they notice the venues that don't do that, because not all venues do that.
Yeah, that's definitely true. But I mean, there is such a thriving local scene still. And there's tons of great bands out there. Whatever kind of music you're into, maybe with a few minor exceptions, but pretty much whatever you're into, you can find somebody that's doing that on a pretty regular basis, whether it's like an established venue in the city or a more underground warehouse space in Oakland, or even a corporate sponsored event like the Converse Represent events that we had here at Slim's. And I definitely respect that they also made an effort to put local artists on pretty much all of those bills, even though they brought in some heavy hitters.
Oh, yeah.
Seeing Saviors on the same bill with Mastodon and Hot Lunch as well. I mean, it's, that's awesome. They didn't have to do that.
Right.
They could have left it at High on Fire and Mastodon, and people would have loved it.
People would have come, yeah.
Right. So it's, I appreciate businesses that are kind of taking this into account and really trying to find ways to establish the local scene and keep it going. And that really is the point of this podcast and the content that we do on the Slims Presents blog, is to provide people with an opportunity to realize that there is all this great stuff happening, and there are brilliant artists living probably, a few blocks down from you, and just tune into it and, see what there is. And if you like it, go back, check them out again.
Yeah.
Buy their record,
Buy a t-shirt.
go and buy some food, buy some drinks, support the businesses, support the artists, stop giving your money to, corporate coffee chains and start giving it to the people that are actually giving meaning to your life. But anyway, I think we're going to wind this down with some trivia. Our trivia this week is San Francisco themed, going with our discussion here. We've been talking about a lot about local music and the culture of San Francisco and politics and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be the focus of our trivia. The prize for this trivia is a pair of tickets to go see an awesome local band, the Soft White 60s, here at Slim's on Friday, April 25th. If you haven't seen them, they're a lot of fun live. So you're definitely going to want to check out that show and support local music, even though you're not paying for the ticket. Come and buy their CD. Use that money to buy a t-shirt and have some drinks at the bar so we don't go out of business. All right, so the first person to answer all of these 5 trivia questions correctly and email me the answers at info@slimspresents.com will win a pair of tickets to the Soft White 60s at Slim's Friday, April 25th. Question number 1. This famous San Francisco landmark was built on a plot of land that was exclusively sand dunes before its construction. What is that San Francisco landmark? Unlikely, given the way it looks today. Question number 2. Due to the restrictions of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, many Chinese immigrants spent years on this island waiting for entry into San Francisco. What's the name of the island? Question number 3. Damage from 1989's Loma Prieta quake forced the closure and demolition of this incomplete and controversial freeway project. I'll accept 2 possible answers for this one. Question number 4. The Loma Prieta quake happened to occur during ABC's national television broadcast of the 1989 World Series. What TV comedy show did the network switch over to when the feed was lost from Candlestick Park? What sitcom did they cut to? You might have to Google that one if you weren't around. Okay, question number 5. In this 1996 film, Robert De Niro plays a man obsessed with fictional San Francisco Giants player Bobby Rayburn. What's the name of that movie? All right, first person to send all 5 correct answers to me at info@slimspresents.com wins a pair of tickets to see the Soft White 60s at Slim's Friday, April 25th. I want to thank Ian Port again for coming down and being our guest tonight.
Thank you.
Definitely go and follow him on Twitter, iPort, or follow his All Shook Down blog at SF All Shook Down. You can find him on the SF Weekly site. You can find him in print every Wednesday. Just walk to pretty much any street corner in San Francisco and pick up an SF Weekly and support the people that are trying to make something out of this fucking city. All right. Thank you for tuning in, people, once again to Between You, Me, and Jose, the Slims Presents podcast. Thanks again to Ian. We'll be back next week, every Wednesday, with a new guest. So follow us on Twitter at BYMJ Podcast, or you can follow our YouTube account, Slims Presents, and we do lots of other cool content on there as well. And you can go to our website and see our blog and see everything we do. So thanks again. I'll see you guys next week with another guest.